Thank you very much. I'll just give the 60 seconds on the panelists because they really are outstanding on the wholesale market reform question. Jamey Goldin was my law partner here until not too long ago and is now in-house at Google. Steve Levitas was my favorite expert witness at a avoided cost proceeding last year at the Public Service Commission. He is the Senior VP for Regulatory and Government Affairs at Pinegate Renewables. And then Alex Glenn is a Senior VP for State and Federal Regulatory Legal Support for Duke Energy. So we're lucky to have all these guys with us. So I'll just quickly frame up kind of historically and maybe provide a metaphor for this whole debate around wholesale market reform. Jamey has heard me use this metaphor before, but the question of whether or not we're going through a paradigm shift in the energy industry really is kind of front and center. You know, that's Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science. He came up with the metaphor paradigm shift to really describe changes in the governing scientific paradigm and how over time anomalies in the governing paradigm cause the governing paradigm to be overthrown by a new paradigm. So the question really is, are we in the middle of a paradigm shift within the energy industry? And I mean, so what we're going to talk about today is, should there be a shift? What are the policy reasons for making that shift? And what is the process for making that shift? And what could this shift look like? What are the different options? I will let Jamey tee it off. Jamey, I'll let you sort of go through your piece, and then Alex, and then Steve, and then we'll do questions at the end. I would encourage everybody to funnel questions through the chat room to me. I've got plenty of questions that I want to ask these guys, but I would encourage more questions. Jamey, I'm going to tee it up and let you go.
Sounds good. Thanks, Weston. And again, Jamey Goldin here. I am regulatory counsel at Google. Proud to be on this panel with some of the top thought leaders in the Southeast on energy and really in the country on energy. And so I know this is a different format than we're accustomed to, but this is, you know, kind of our new normal these days, or hopefully not too much longer. But in looking at market reform, really, you know, it kind of dawned on me, and we're calling it market reform, which is accurate in North Carolina, but really maybe it should be called market formation in South Carolina, because we don't have an organized market in any of the territories in South Carolina. At least in North Carolina, there is PJM that dips down into the northern part of it. But either way, in South Carolina in 2020, it was an active legislative year. Act number 187 of 2020 was actually introduced in early January. It was not a pre-filed bill, but it was H4940, and it moved rather quickly through the House, made it to the Senate, several Senate hearings on it, teed up, ready to go. 13th, I think, was the date that it was to be sent to the floor. And for those of y'all that kind of remember, I think that was the day the sky fell, and COVID took us all out of in-person meetings. And so the General Assembly of South Carolina went on pause for a while and decided to come back late summer and then come back in October. And so H4940 was fortunately one of the bills prioritized by the General Assembly when they came back in late summer, early fall, to do, along with COVID relief and along with other pressing matters on Santee. The market reform study bill was passed by the Senate, sent back to the House, and it sets up a committee for next to be formed and populated. In fact, I think right now the members are being appointed, hopefully by the end of the year, but it will be a year-long at least process where all of the utilities, incumbent utilities in the state, all of the interested parties that I think we could identify, because if you look at the non-advisory board, I think you've got basically every representation in the state will come together along with 8 lawmakers, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, each of which must represent either a Duke territory, a Dominion territory, a Santee direct served territory, or co-op served territory. And so you'll have 8 voting members under the study committee. And then really probably, I think, one of the more important, if not most important parts of that is, what are they charged to do? Well, they're charged to look at every possible alternative to what we currently have, what the utilities currently have in South Carolina, which is the vertically integrated monopoly model. And so they are going to look around the country at every other form of energy delivery, whether it be an organized market. I believe retail choice deregulation, full scale, is actually something that's on the table and something that is of interest to legislators. And RTOs, energy imbalance market, and the status quo. And they'll hire an outside third-party expert consultant to do a report and come back with findings on what is best for South Carolina, what actually is the best going forward. And it may be the status quo, maybe an RTO, it may be, retail choice, customer choice, who knows? But that is what the next year will be spent doing in South Carolina. Next slide, please. And again, this talks about the intent is to study, whether or how restructuring the existing utility service model, the utility structure in South Carolina is needed. And if so, what do we want that to look like? And again, it is an important component in there that nuclear is protected, essentially, that there was a specific carve out in there that existing nuclear should not, divestiture of that should not be, a potential outcome. And so there's a deadline for a report to be issued, or at least for the committee to give a report to the legislature by November 1 of 2021. So again, as I said, we've got now, I guess, 10 and a half months to really dig in. And next slide. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's not just an RTO study, what was enacted. They really wanted all options on the table. This isn't just look at joining PJM. This isn't just look at, some sort of South Carolina only market. Really look around the country at the good, the bad, the ugly. We know that no market is perfect. Why not create one, from other experience? Because next slide. Because I think there are proponents of markets that do recognize the value of not only the cost advantages of markets from a customer perspective, but also an emissions reduction advantage that is enjoyed in RTOs, and also renewable energy transactions that occur. It's no secret, 80% of all corporate renewable energy PPAs are done in a market. So, that's kind of the benefits in a nutshell. And certainly I'll come back with questions on what an RTO is, but I just want to run through these slides. If I can go to the next one. Here, and if you go back one to the map, I think this is particularly impactful. If you see the pretty colors all on the map, that's the organized competitive power markets around the country. And if you look at that gray area, you notice gaps in two real regions two regions. You've got the Western unorganized part, and then you've got the Southeast. And when we've got the highest or some of the highest utility bills in the country, and we have gray there, it kind of leads one to wonder if, some legislation making us into one of those might lower bills for customers. So, we can't do this in a bubble. And if we go to the next slide, there are, obviously, there have been numerous studies about competition and ratepayer savings. I think it's, again, I alluded to that, 80% roughly of all commercial PPAs occur in RTO. I think Brattle did a study here that shows that if Duke customers in North Carolina joined, or if Duke joined PJM, that their customers would enjoy a savings of $411 to $593 million a year, and that then there was a recent energy innovation policy study that talked about a southeastern RTO, basically that gray area. And it said that by 2040, there'd be a net benefit customer savings to $384 billion in customer savings by 2040, according to that study. And so I think there's just, this is the conversation that we are going to be having, and that's what the act called for. So that's kind of where we are.
Thank you. And I really liked Weston, your paradigm analogy. And I look at some of the panelists today, this morning and this afternoon, who are not my age but much younger. And I look at Jamey, and I look at Emily Felt and Rebecca Doolin and the two Bens, and it's an incredibly exciting time and opportunity in the electric industry. I don't think we've ever seen this amount of change, the pace and the complexity of this in my 30 years in doing this. And I think Jamey laid it out really well. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through all of these very quickly. If we keep going. Yeah, right here. The next 2 or 3 slides, just wanted to give you a flavor, because the question that I think we really need to ask as we move forward in any study atmosphere is, what are the problems we're trying to solve? Number one, what are we trying to solve? What do we want to accomplish? And whose problems are we trying to solve? I think those are 2 really critical questions that we need to answer. And so as you look at our operational performance and safety, environmental, which are both national leaders, generation, and our nuclear fleet, which is number 1 or 2 in the entire country and world, our grid reliability is excellent. If you go to the next slide. Thanks. Our net promoter score is increasing 62% by that. And if you look at that net promoter scores, anything really above 50 is actually very good. Once you get to 70, that's like a Southwest Airlines type of score. Our average customer rates. So if you go back and you think about those 2 gray areas on Jamey's map, the 2 things that they have in common, yes, they're vertically integrated, non-restructured markets. They also have the lowest prices in the country for residential customers, commercial customers, and on average, industrial customers. And so we need to understand what is it that we're trying to solve in South Carolina and in the Southeast. Is there a problem? Is this a solution that's looking for a problem? Next slide, please. So one of the things is balancing the interests of everyone. Jamey's company, Google, as well as Amazon and Walmart and others, are setting incredibly high goals to get to net zero in their energy consumption. I think by 2025 was Amazon's, or 2030 is Google's and Walmart's, which are laudable goals, right? Those are things that I think we aspire to as a company, to get to net zero by 2050. We've made a lot of progress so far, but there's a lot more to go. And if you look at that, we've added 8 gigawatts of renewables on our system and retired 6.5 gigawatts of coal. We've got another 9 gigawatts in the Carolinas to retire. So if we go to the next slide. This one is not an eye chart. It's not hieroglyphics. This came out wrong in the translation. Really, what this looks like and shows is that in the Carolinas, DEC and DEP are the second lowest carbon intensity footprint in the country. As we look at our peers of large electric utilities, we're about 37% below the carbon footprint of PJM right now in the Carolinas. So as we look at there are groups represented here on solar side and on renewable energy and on environmental groups. How are we going to get more renewables? We've got a pretty good baseline right now, but there's more to do. So next slide, please. So one of the areas that we thought about was SEAM and the Southeast Energy Exchange Market. And this was really driven by a couple of things. One is we've got a very friction-full wholesale market, meaning traders call up people, they IM people, and they say other utilities and other merchants, hey, do you have power? What does it cost? What we wanted to do here was make that friction less. And so the tweak, it's really a tweak to the existing wholesale power market in this region. And so you can see it's made up of about 15 or 16 utilities, including most of them are non-FERC jurisdictional, like munis and co-ops across. It's in 2 time zones, as you'll see. So next slide. So the SEAM footprint right now has about 160 gigawatts of capacity, roughly the same as a little bit less. And so what were the goals when the folks got together and talked about this? One, it was lower cost to customers. So can we reduce those energy costs? 2 was, how do we optimize renewable energy resources? And this particularly coming from Missouri, Georgia, North and South Carolina, where we are seeing a bow wave of renewable energy coming onto the system. What we've got, how much, Jamey or Steve knows right off the back of his hand, how many gigawatts we've actually installed in the Carolinas. I think it's around 5.5 gigawatts, right? Second most in the entire country of utility scale solar. Compared to PJM, which I think has installed 1.5 gigawatts after 30 years of being in the market. So we want to optimize that, including core principles, and minimize bureaucracy, participation's voluntary. And we didn't want to disrupt the state's ability to control generation planning and transmission investments. So that's what the goals and principles were. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so what is SEAM? It's really an overlay of the existing bilateral energy market. And so what it is, there's 2 principal things it does. One, it provides for no cost transmission service and intra-hour 15-minute energy trading. And it's an energy only. It's not capacity. It's nothing to do about capacity planning. So it's really developing software that can match bidders very easily and take advantage of low cost energy that's being generated in one area to the other. If we go forward. So what it's not going to replace or change the existing balancing authority areas or the transmission service providers' reliability requirements. Those will stay the same. Next slide, please. And there's been a lot of discussion about EIMs, energy imbalance market, and Southeast energy exchange markets, and they're different constructs, clearly. One is much more complex, much more costly, takes a lot longer to get in place. SEAM, we believe you can get in place in a year and start delivering about $40 to $50 million of value in savings to customers annually. And so as we look at that and we look at some of those other studies, that are out there claiming lots of studies, I think they need to be put in context as to what they really are. The Brattle study was not really a study. It's a white paper, and it really just applies generic PJM and MISO claim savings and overlays that in the Southeast. The Vibrant Energy study out of Boulder, Colorado, and I think San Francisco really has some significant flaws. And if you think about it, one of those is 41 gigawatts of solar and wind. And if you think about that, that's the entire acreage of the state of Connecticut that you would be covering with wind and solar. And so we need to look at the specific geographies, what's available and what's really feasible. And if you look at the savings that are generated by the Vibrant Energy Study, you look at 384 billion. Think about that. That's 6 times the current savings that PJM claims. So we got to think about, if it sounds too good to be true, is it really? So next slide, please. So participation criteria are laid out here. I'm not going to go into much detail given time, but generally members are load serving entities, and participants are anyone who can physically participate in the regional wholesale market that we have today. I think last slide. Here are the benefits. And again, one of the benefits that we see is better accommodating renewables onto the system and existing renewables. AECI out of Missouri is a co-op. They have about 1,800 megawatts of wind load that's roughly equal to their entire capacity that they need coming onto their system, which they can't handle. So they're looking for places that maybe, right, with zero cost transmission, you can get that to other areas, reduce our customers' fuel costs by using that wind energy when they don't need it, and maybe we do. Vice versa with solar, not curtailing it at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon when we may not need all of that on our Duke system, and sending that to TVA where it may be cloudy or their peak time is 1 hour difference. So I think there's some really good benefits that we can extract as this moves forward. Next slide, please. That's it. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and I really can't thank Bonnie enough for allowing me to speak here today. Thank you.
Hey, Alex, this is Weston. I'm going to sort of weave these questions in as I get them. This is probably a question for you. I'll read this to you. It says, if SEAM is an energy-only market, will the utilities not be able to rely on it to address their reserve margin requirements or other resource planning requirements?
That's correct. Resource planning stays with the state. It's an energy-only market, so very, very different. And the one thing I would point out is that nothing in SEAM precludes an EIM in the future. Or an RTO or some type of different market structure in the future. And the idea was, let's look at this, let's learn. And frankly, to get 16 utilities across, 7 or 8 states together and agree on, one thing, let alone 3 or 4 is a pretty big undertaking because we're not all aligned.
I got it. Well, thank you for that, Alex. That was great. We're going to turn to Steve Levitas. Steve, you're up.
Thank you, Weston, and good morning, everyone. I am Steve Levitas with Pine Gate Renewables. For those of you who may not know, Pine Gate is a utility-scale solar developer based here in Asheville, North Carolina. We are working in probably 15 or more states now, but the Carolinas have been our biggest market, and I think it's fair to say we're one of the largest developers active in both states. Jamey, could move to the next slide, please. Jamey and I got our signals crossed a little bit in that I was going to talk about Act 187 as well. Good news is he did a better job than I would have done, and it's going to save you some time that we'll have for more for discussion. Let me just add a couple of things about Act 187. One is that it does require funding. This is a very, as Jamey described, a very detailed, complex study process that can't be accomplished without outside resources, and efforts are underway. Jamey may actually have more of an update than I do, but I know there are active efforts that we and others are involved in to raise both state and federal funds to conduct the study. The other thing I was just going to mention, Jamey talked about how inclusive and far-reaching the scope of this study is, and that's certainly true. I wanted to mention just a couple of additional elements included, just to give you a sense of how far-reaching it is, in that in addition to all of the wholesale market structures that are on the table for consideration and the possibility of retail choice, as Jamey mentioned, other policies particularly called out or programs are utility divestiture of generation, community aggregation, as we've seen in California. And the study also, interestingly, gets beyond market structures and actually includes mechanisms to accelerate reduction of emissions. So it's beyond just the structural issues. It's going to be really interesting to see how this process works, that plays out. I was heavily involved with a similar study over 20 years ago in North Carolina that was actually led to a consensus among utilities and other stakeholders, including Alex's company, to introduce retail choice and deregulation in North Carolina at that time. And Enron imploded and the California market imploded, and that was the end of about 4 years of work that a lot of people put into that process. So if we could just skip ahead to my North Carolina slides, which are maybe about 8 slides in. There we go. So for those of you who don't know, Ben Smith may have touched on this at the outset, but in the fall of 2018, Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina issued Executive Order 80, which dealt broadly with responding to the threat of climate change and the need for decarbonization. And he focused particularly on reducing carbon emissions from the electric industry, but looking at other sectors as well. What followed from Executive Order 80 was a 1-year process, or almost year-long process, of developing a comprehensive clean energy plan, which the Cooper administration released in September of last year. Very detailed, kind of every policy and program that you could possibly think of related to decarbonization, and but at a fairly high level. And so what was needed after the release of that plan was more of kind of nuts and bolts, down in the weeds proposals to implement some or all of the plan. And what resulted from that, the administration created what you see here, the North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process, or NERP. And NERP is a broadly inclusive stakeholder process that has worked very intensively over the last year, mainly through 2 large committees whose names are derived from sections of the plan. The A1 committee has dealt with decarbonization and looking at modeling of different policies and approaches to decarbonization, while the B1 committee, which I've been a part of, has looked at market structures and related issues. The B1 committee has 4 subcommittees, which deal with asset retirement, specifically coal plant retirement, and the focus has been on securitization as a tool for cost recovery for the unamortized net book value of retired assets. So there's been an asset retirement committee. There's a committee, and I suspect, I haven't studied the agenda closely enough, I suspect we may hear about some of these issues over the course of the day. There's a second subcommittee that deals with performance-based rate making, which is defined to include not only performance incentive mechanisms, but also decoupling and multi-year rate plans of the sort that Duke has sought last year in legislation in North Carolina that was not passed. There's a third subcommittee that I co-chair that is dealing with competitive solicitation and models for future procurement. And then the fourth subcommittee of interest here is the wholesale market options subgroup. And in a nutshell, and I should say that NERP is winding down. It is producing its final work product as we speak. And what is going to come out of this wholesale market subcommittee is recommendations to study many of the same things that are reflected and addressed in Act 187. If I get the next slide, please. And you see that I think it's fair to say that the North Carolina the recommendations are not perhaps as far-reaching as is Act 187, which really is everything in the kitchen sink, but really focused on market structure and looking specifically at the possibility of a regional transmission organization, either for the Carolinas or across the Southeast, an energy balance market of the sort that has been very successful in the Western United States, as well as Duke and the other utilities seeing proposal. I think, next slide, please. As in South Carolina, this process was expected to recommend legislation, come back to the legislature. I'm not sure if they've come up with a deadline yet, but I expect this to be a one-year study. So interestingly, I don't think this has been resolved yet, but I believe that the current thinking, and still a work in progress, is to task the North Carolina Utilities Commission with actually being the entity that would perform this study, rather than having a study committee comprised of legislators, as Act 187 does in South Carolina, or a new citizen committee or commission of some sort. North Carolina Utilities Commission has a lot on its plate, and in order for it to play that role, it clearly would have to hire outside consultants and rely heavily on them to do the work. There is a recommendation to include a similar broadly inclusive multi-stakeholder advisory board or committee of the sort that has been enacted in South Carolina as well. Next slide, but I think I'm about at the end. Yeah, good. So I'll stop there and look forward to discussing all of these issues with the panel and with the audience.
All right, and I've got a question for Steve and Jamey that just came in through the chat room. The question really is, how does more competition benefit the average South Carolinian? I mean, in other words, what they really are saying is, you know, Jamey and Steve are both arguing for more competition, and I think the question really is, what does that mean for the average South Carolinian, the average bill payer? How does that benefit?
Weston, can you hear me? My battery just went out on the laptop, so I've had to dial back in.
Yeah, I got you. I hear you.
Okay, just making sure. So that's a good question, and you know, I think it's important to go back to something that both I and Alex alluded to, and let's make sure that we're talking, you know, apples to apples. I noted that South Carolina and the Southeast in general, that South Carolina it suffers from some of, if not the highest, residential power bills in the entire country. And Alex said, you know, that the rates are some of the lowest in the country. And so you look at that and say, well, how can that be true? What are you as lying? And that's not true. And so when you look, most people don't care what their rate is. How many of us, even as being in this field, when we get our bill every month, when I get my bill from Dominion, when I get a co-op bill, I don't look at what that kilowatt hour number is, okay, on the rate. I don't care what my rate is. I care what I'm having to stroke a check for every month to satisfy that bill. And so when I say South Carolinians are paying the highest bills in the country, or the second highest bills in the country, that's what I mean. And so how do we get bills that high? Well, the rates may be low, but then you've got riders, you've got adders, you've got other components of a bill that end up costing, you know, ratepayers astronomical sums. And so to get competition in the market, we know from looking at it that not only do bills in competitive markets or organized market regions increase more slowly, but they actually reduce cost a lot of the times because there are efficiencies. And I think SEAM, to Alex's point, is a great first springboard into this foray of, you know, a primer for an organized market in the Southeast, because I think SEAM on its face is an admission that there are efficiencies in working together as 16 utilities across state lines, across balancing authorities, to efficiently deliver power. So you go and you look at, is SEEM a competitive market? Absolutely not. You cannot, unless you're one of those utilities, you're not allowed to participate in it, period. In a competitive market, let's distill it down a little bit. A competitive regional organized market means that an independent system operator is dispatching power at the most economical price first. So whatever resource is clearing the market at the lowest price is dispatched first. So that drives down that cost just by the nature of it. You insert competition into it. And so, again, like I said, I applaud the idea of working across state lines, across balancing authorities and SEEM, and think that if there are efficiencies to be found in SEEM, why not? Why would we leave anything on the table, I guess is my question. And that's where I believe competition steps in, and it reduces the bills that South Carolinians pay and North Carolinians. I mean, Steve, I think you probably did a great job, and I actually have a question for you, Steve, after you opine on this question. But anyways, that's my thoughts on it.
All right, I'll let Steve add anything he wants to that, and then I'm going to go back to Alex.
Well, I think Jamey did a good job responding on price. I would just point out that price is not the only consideration, and as everybody knows, and Jamey's discussed, and Jamey's the sort of standard bearer on this in the Carolinas, there is overwhelming customer, and Alex touched on it too, overwhelming customer demand for clean energy. Overwhelming, to the point that there are many major corporations in this country that will today not make investments in states and not new facilities in states that do not give them an opportunity to achieve their corporate goals of sustainable energy and decarbonization. And a major, and Alex talked about what problem are we trying to solve for. A major problem that we have in the Carolinas is that we do not have the ability on any significant, meaningful scale to offer a 100% clean energy portfolio to any customers, but certainly not large commercial industrial customers. Those customers, by definition, absent the limited number of kind of special programs that we have, their energy footprint in the Carolinas is going to be, by definition, be identical to that of their monopoly utility supplier. So in Duke's case, and we commend Duke for the improvements that it's making, but today and for the foreseeable future, it's still going to have a significant portion, 25 to 30% coal, 30% or more gas. Of course, the nuclear does satisfy the clean energy carbon-free component. I don't know how various companies count that in their requirements, but the point is the renewables component is in the single to low double-digit numbers, and if we don't figure out a way to change that either through market structure or through decarbonization, we're going to have adverse economic development impacts in both Carolinas.
I'll turn back to Alex here. Alex, is there anything you want to address in anything Jamey or Steve said as to rates versus bills or any of these issues?
Yeah, I think so. And Jamey, I think in both Steve raised really good points. And when we look at what drives a bill and the overall price to the customer, it's usage. And so if you're looking at pushing down customers' bills, then how do we work to find rate designs for low-income customers? How do we find ways of energy efficiency and demand-side management to shave that peak? That's an issue. That's a solution that can solve that problem. Because in Northern California, for example, the usage is different than in Columbia, South Carolina. And so bills are driven in Columbia, South Carolina by air conditioning and by inefficient heating and housing stock. That's what drives it. So the same customer bill in South Carolina for a Duke Energy customer in the Cal ISO RTO would be 4 times as high, between 3 and 4 times as high as a bill with similar usage. That's what's really important. That's why there's no manufacturing in California, because the prices are so high. And so I think we really need to look at those types of issues and see what is the solution. And when I look and I heard Steve say, about no one has a carbon-free offering, for 100% clean energy. Remember, many customers who want clean energy, have these clean energy goals, are large industries and large companies like data centers. And so when you look at that, that's not looking out for small, medium businesses, for the average residential customer who can't afford to do that, really. And so we need to look at how will this impact the whole customer base, not just specific companies that have renewable energy targets, which are great things and which drive really good behaviors. And then the third point I would make is that we as a utility have to be more innovative, right? Customers are demanding specific, unique services and products. And so we've got to be more innovative in our rate design. And that's something that regulators could help with as well. And so without incurring this huge bureaucracy of an RTO or retail competition where you blow up the entire utility model, are there solutions that can maintain our low cost advantage, bring more jobs to these states? So, and that's where I think we can learn from the Jameys of the world, the Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world, and the best practices that they've applied in other markets.
I'll pause there and see if Steve or Jamey would like to respond to that in any way. And if not, we'll move on to another topic. So this is really a question for, and I think you hit on some of this, Alex, but this is a question that somebody put into the chat room to me. What's the principal argument against doing an RTO? I mean, if you had to just say you get one reason, this is a monocausal explanation. What's your main reason for not?
Well, I think you need to look at it. RTO. What do you mean by that? Do you mean retail choice combined with an RTO where you blow up the electric utility, or do you just mean
not retail? Okay, just from the wholesale side.
Just from the wholesale side is, I think you cede state control over your future to FERC, into an unelected body that now makes the rules, of which you have very, very little say in how transmission is planned and what capacity is built. So if you look at MISO, for example, most of the capacity and energy that you get, even in that fully kind of vertically integrated model, is based on price alone, and that's driven by cheap coal and cheap natural gas.
I'll pause there. And Steve or Jamey, any response to that loss of control?
Yes, I do not think that an RTO or an energy imbalance market or ISO in any way takes away state authority. But what I would point to, I think it's funny or kind of humorous that, SEEM is purported as not taking away any authority from the states, not in any way being a preemptive measure. And yet in neither state was SEEM filed in a docket. Rather, it is a courtesy filing that we're going to be filing this at FERC. And so this argument that SEEM somehow is a state-driven, state jurisdictional thing, and an RTO is not, I don't quite get it, especially when I assume they'll both be filed under Section 205, I guess, of the Federal Power Act. So if there's not jurisdiction over SEEM at the state commissions, then why is it okay? But if there's not jurisdiction over an RTO at the state commission, why is that bad? That would be my legal question, I guess, or factual. I don't know.
I'll let Alex or Steve, if you want to comment, then I'll go back to Alex.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I do think Alex makes an important point, and it's an issue about RTOs that gives pause to those of us in the renewable sector and in the environmental community, is that as FERC has overseen the RTOs and ISOs, it's done some very good things with respect to market access, with respect to, say, storage devices and now distributed energy resources. And it has adopted disastrous policy with respect to the overriding of state renewable energy policies and goals. I'm very hopeful that in the Biden administration and newly constituted FERC, we will see those ill-advised policies reconsidered and revisited. They have caused states in PJM to consider leaving PJM. So we certainly would not want to see a situation, and this is sort of the specter that Alex paints with some justification, that an RTO could actually be bad for renewable energy in the Southeast. If I may, I just want to come back to one thing. I was on mute. I was trying to respond to something that Alex said earlier. I just want to be sure that everybody understands that when we talk about programs to address large customer demand for renewable energy, in both Carolina laws, in both of the Carolinas by statute, the programs designed to achieve those goals cannot prejudice non-participating ratepayers. So no one is suggesting that Jamey's company be subsidized by residential ratepayers or anybody else in the process of achieving their clean energy goals.
Alex, any further thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, just a couple. One, with respect to what Jamey said, the current wholesale market right now in the entire Southeast, as well as in the Pacific Northwest, is oversight by FERC. That is not state jurisdictional. And we're not making any changes to any state jurisdictional things like capacity planning, IRPs, transmission siting, power plant siting, any of that. And so it's a very slight modification to the existing wholesale market for the benefit of customers, for lower energy costs if we can get it. And if we can't, we can't. And we don't have a big capital outlay, more than $5 million of developing the software. And to Steve's point, which I think is a very, very good one, that state policies are the ones that drive renewables, and certainly federal tax credits and things like that drive it. But at the state level, and with an RTO, you lose that, because you look at New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the P, the J, and the M are all looking at how do we get out of the P, J, and M. And it's because FERC doesn't care about renewables really right now, and probably they care about the market and the market price. And so what's the lowest price that's going to drive that market? And so they kind of ignore state carve-outs for nuclear and carve-outs for renewables, and that's put the PJM capacity market in a tailspin.
Just one thing, Weston, on that.
Yeah.
I would say that FERC cares about abstract market principles or philosophy, not actually about the best outcome for ratepayers, because the effect of their minimum offer price regulation is to actually increase the cost of ratepayers and to require more capacity to be built, because we're effectively ignoring renewable capacity that's in the ground.
It's a good point. And then how do you influence it, right? What's your voice before the FERC or the RTO to influence that?
Hey, Weston, if I could just say,
yes,
kind of shifting to another topic. Alex mentioned the $5 million of software costs for SEAM. And I think others in the renewable industry recognize the idea of, I think Duke has said, maybe it's even Alex's word, that they need to walk before they run, or need to take some initial steps, and it seems designed as a first step that could lead to other forms of market reform. And I mean, I appreciate that in concept, but I have to say I had heard 3 million, Alex says $5 million of expenditure. I'm frankly surprised that when you have utilities with 160 plus gigawatts of load, and I'm guessing annual revenues well over $100 billion, that that it's thought that all that could be reasonably expended towards this sort of market reform is $5 million. And I think I heard a number that may be going to an EIM, which has the potential for, I think, substantially more savings for ratepayers, would cost maybe $50 million in software costs. That doesn't seem like a lot to spend given the balance sheets of the companies that we're talking about.
Yeah, Steve, to your point, Weston, if I could.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you have 5 million upfront startup costs and maybe $2 to $3 million in annual costs. And to do an EIM, we would have to spend probably 50 or 60, $70 million just at Duke to get nodal pricing, to get 5-minute pricing, to do all of that. And what I would say is trying to get 16 utilities, some of which are small, some of which are large, some of which have no interest in an EIM, or their states have no interest in whatever, right, is a difficult thing. So what we thought as Duke Energy is, can we do this, get it up and running, show value, and then let's see, can you do more? And if you can, does it make sense? Let's study that. But that was the kind of the analysis, and I don't have control over 15 other utilities. Wish I did.
And we'll pause there for a second, and unless Jamie's got a comment, I might move to some procedure-related questions. Jamie, are you ready to move on, or do you want to add anything to any of that?
No. I think Alex is. I think that is accurate. That walk before you run, and that SEAM, the platform implementation of it, assuming it's approved, is not a bad thing. It's a good test case, and at the same time, we're going to have the South Carolina study process. And my hope would be, just like y'all did in South Carolina, you would support the same study in North Carolina if it comes out of Steve. The question I was going to ask Steve is, the NERC recommendations. Do we think there will be a recommendation to have a similar study in North Carolina, since you've been a part of that?
I think so. And Alex may be able to speak to it better than I can. I had some conversations with Duke, is certainly heavily represented in these committees, and I certainly don't want to speak for them, but I think there's a pretty broad consensus. A study of this sort going on in South Carolina, we really would be remiss not to try to parallel that as much as we reasonably can in North Carolina.
Alex, anything to add? If not, I'll move on to these process questions that I wanted to pose.
Sure. Yeah, I just think that, the North Carolina process is Chatham House rules. So I think we're not supposed to discuss what goes on there. I would say that I don't think there's unanimity among the group on whether everybody's aligned on what will ever come out of that. Right.
So my question, I guess this is sort of to start with Steve and Jamie, but I think Alex could add to this. If we go down the path of this RTO for the Carolinas, or the Carolinas joining PJM, give me a sense of the FERC process, the legislative process, and the commission processes. I know that's a lot to bite off, but could either Steve or Jamie or Alex give us sort of an overview of what that might look like? Let's assume what it is this is there's an RTO for the Carolinas. What would that look like procedurally?
So I'll take a crack at it. I think you've got to assume various hypotheticals here, or various possibilities. One option would be that a utility would voluntarily, or several utilities would come together and voluntarily want to join an existing RTO, create a new RTO. So that would be voluntary and would require them making a FERC filing, presumably under Section 205 and probably 203 of the Federal Power Act. I could be missing a section there, and I'll defer to Steve and Alex on that because they know more. They've forgotten more about the Federal Power Act than I will ever learn. So, but I would say that in that situation, that's where, sort of like SEAM, if you get, the players involved, that would be the avenue. Another avenue is if you've got unwilling participants, if you've got some utilities in the Carolinas that want to join an existing one or create an RTO, but you've got other utilities that do not, then you would have to have, I believe, a state legislative mandate. I think it's for the legislature of South Carolina and North Carolina to decide what's best, and so they would presumably pass a law that sets up the process to put the utilities into formation of the RTO. Again, that would be that way. I think probably a third model, and it's interesting to think about, say Santee, for example. Let's say that they wanted, or the legislature wanted them to become wires only. Let's say they wanted them to become an RTO, and Duke wasn't ready to make that step. Well, how let's say Santee's idea was to tap into PJM, let's say, or the General Assembly wanted that to happen. How did they connect? And so I believe it's Section 210 of the Federal Power Act that would then Duke would have to basically will that generation and to Santee across their lines, and would be compensated for doing so. But that's kind of a low level, understanding of maybe three different scenarios that could happen. And, I think there are multiple ways to skin the cat. And, I think that's why the conversation will keep going.
And Alex or Steve, anything to add to that process?
Yeah, I think it depends on ultimately the scope of the RTO, whether it's a retail choice deregulated sell-off generation.
I think if it's a wholesale market just for the Carolinas, make those assumptions.
Yeah, I think with that, and you keep your generation, you would need state law, I believe, in both states, because you would be giving up your transmission planning authority of the commission, in siting. So I think that would require a state law, and that one I'm not sure that scratches Jamey's itch, or maybe Steve's and his company's itch, which is really retail access to wholesale power, right? Is choice. And so I'm not sure that gets there, right? And I'm not sure that a big, just a Carolinas RTO, I don't think you get economies of scale that really would justify the costs.
And I'll pause there for Steve or Jamey. Anything to add in response to that?
No, I think, Alex, that's a good point. I think that, having maybe combining the Carolinas, again, subject to some modeling, that might decarbonize and lower prices. Certainly, we would have to enact regulatory mechanisms to account for, such as securitization, to account for the uneconomic coal coming off, those kind of things. But I don't know that a South Carolina ISO would do a whole lot. You're just kind of shuffling the chairs at the table, and you're not really changing you're not flipping the table over. The one thing I think it's Steve and Alex both talked about is, it's being driven, or it's being alleged that, RTOs are being driven by companies with sustainable goals, net zero carbon, clean power procurement, you name it. And in part that's true. But let's not lose sight on the fact that, these are companies that employ a lot of people, they bring jobs in, they're coveted. And so to Steve's point, the large employers looking around the United States on where to go from an economic development perspective, they're going to look at what the source is of that generation. If they've got a clean power goal, they're going to look at how much it costs. I mean, those are the two factors they're going to look at. And so, do we want to bring well-paying jobs or more well-paying jobs into the Carolinas? I think the answer between all three of us is a resounding yes. None of us don't want, that to happen. And so anything we can do to facilitate that helps. I think secondly, Google's position has always been that our users are all customers of utilities, and we will not do anything or push any policy that would increase their electricity bills. And so it's not about this pie in the sky lowering costs for large companies and putting it on the backs of anyone else. That's certainly not what we are advocating for at all, and that's not what we're going for. And finally, I would say, let's be honest, decarbonization, no matter how we get there, is a win for everyone. It's bipartisan support. I think we all recognize that climate change is real, and we all have a duty to improve the sustainability of this country, because frankly, and of this planet, because if we keep at this current pace, it's not sustainable. And so I think regardless of how we get there, that benefits everyone. That's not just large companies with aggressive renewable goals. That's good for everyone. So that's kind of just, I wanted to make sure that got out there.
Jamey, what about the wholesale market reform? I mean, have you heard any scuttlebutt about this being bandied about in Georgia and Florida? I mean, surely this is not simply going to be contained within the bounds of the Carolinas. Surely this debate is happening in other monopolistic IOU states.
Yeah, no, I think, Southern basically is its own, I like to think of it as it has its own RTO given their footprint over there. But there is certainly interest, especially at the commissions of Mississippi, certain, trade groups in Georgia, customer groups in Georgia, of what, expansion westward, would look like. Florida's one, though, and Alex probably can speak better than that since y'all have a presence down there with 10% of the customer load, I think, is served by Duke. But Florida's one that there's just not, I noticed they're not a part of SEAM. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no utility or territory for SEAM for Florida, I think is right. And then, the whole wholesale competition aspect, it seems like Florida is not in the conversation. I don't know why. Alex, any thoughts there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think looking at geography is critically important, and looking at the local geography state by state, because the state, I think, really knows best about how do we balance the interests of all of these different stakeholders. Peninsula Florida is like an island transmission wise. So it only has 2 sets of 500 kV lines going in and out. So there's very, very little infrastructure. So the complexities of trying to, would it add value to have them in SEAM? I don't know that it would. That's not off the table, but there's additional complexities. Same with PJM. It's not just like you bolt on North and South Carolina to PJM. There's a very limited amount of interconnection between PJM and the Carolinas. And so that's, one of the things you really have to look at when you do these studies. What is that really impact of the dispatch? So I think Jamey, you're right. The geography really does matter.
And I'll just pause for either Steve or Jamey. Any response to any of that? And this is a question really for any of you. The sort of retail customer choice question, which I think some political figures are backing, but some corporate entities are maybe not pushing that so hard. But Alex, any comment on sort of retail customer choice?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, you got to look at all of the different customers. And so retail competition, I think that you've seen, there's only 13 states that have retail competition, including the District of Columbia in the country. So a very small minority of states. Those all stopped after Enron, right? There was no other legislature, state legislature, who said, I want to get into that. And the reason is because the lion's shares of customers don't benefit from deregulation. If you look at the cost profile, the rates in deregulated states versus regulated states, they're higher. And when you look at just, call up the Massachusetts AG or the Maryland Attorney General and say whether they think that retail choice has been good for most of their customer base, low fixed income customers, small, medium, it's a resounding no. So I think that's where, we've issues with it. History matters, and we need to look at it. And a point that Jamey made earlier, and I think Steve made earlier too, is to the extent that, the study moves forward, right? Then we got to look at history and we got to improve. And I think there are ways that we can improve and innovate through rate design and other things that's not really throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Jamey, what about your view on the retail choice question?
Yeah, I agree with Alex that there are examples, there are warts in everything, and that's why this study process in North Carolina and the one that's begun already in South Carolina is so important, because we do need to have that conversation of, all right, let's learn about the bad things, let's learn about the good things, and let's create something that is only the benefits and avoids the negative part. I think Texas is an interesting example where they do have retail residential choice, and it's it was a rocky first few years there, but it seems to have turned out fine. But I'm not in any way told that that's the answer. I think competition at the wholesale level is what is needed in an organized market. Not, I think there are policymakers in both Carolinas who just like me, think, well, it'd be nice to be able to choose who my retail provider is, right? It'd be nice, just like my cell phone, do I have AT&T or do I have Verizon? And that's a simplistic way of thinking about it, but it is a way of thinking about it. I don't know, though, that that's necessarily going to solve anything. It could create problems, and I'm certainly not advocating for that. I know there are customer groups that are probably advocating for retail choice. I don't believe that is something that we are advocating for. Again, it's wholesale competition at the generation level.
Can I jump in on this, Weston?
Yes, please, Steve.
Well, first of all, let me say that I personally, my company, and as far as I know, my industry are not advocating for retail choice in the Carolinas. I would not say that's because we think it's a bad idea or has been bad for ratepayers in other places. So I want to take a little bit of issue with what Alex said on that. I think certainly I've read plenty of things that suggest it's been good for ratepayers. But in any case, to the extent that it's not been as good as was hoped, that's in large part because that first generation of programs was not designed well. And a lot of lessons have been learned from that. And you might draw an analogy, say, to the nuclear sector, where a lot of mistakes have been made in the past with respect to nuclear power. We pay a price for that today. And hopefully we'll learn from those mistakes. But the bigger considerations are, first of all, we don't have any interest in having a knockdown, drag-out fight with our friends in the utility sector who are understandably strongly opposed to retail competition. It's not politically feasible, and it's so complicated to pull off. I can tell you from having worked on it for 4 years in the 1990s, it's just not, in my opinion, a good use of our time, anybody's time at this point, even if it might have some benefits. But I do want to say that there are two things that are happening when we talk about retail competition or retail choice. There's competition and choice. So the choice issue, we've talked about some about the need to be able to give customers access to green energy, because that's what they care the most about in terms of choice, and we can talk about how to do that But I want to make a plug on the competition side that I'm strongly of the view, and I mentioned the subcommittee that I actually co-chair with one of Alex's colleagues on competitive solicitation. A lot of the benefits of competition can be accomplished not only through wholesale market structures, but in vertically integrated markets by requiring the utilities to competitively procure the generation that they are going to utilize to serve load. And, you know, Ben Smith this morning talked about the CPRE program in North Carolina. I think there's a very strong trend across the country moving towards, to use your phrase, Weston, a new paradigm where monopoly utilities are allowed to retain monopoly control of generation, but only if they competitively procure the resources, as opposed to just coming in, as has been done in the past, and saying, hey, we'd like to build a gigawatt gas plant. Commission, please give us approval to do that. So I think it's a good alternative paradigm, and we're working hard. I'm working hard to promote that in the Carolinas. And by the way, the South Carolina Commission, pursuant to Act 62, has a generic docket pending on competitive solicitation of renewables.
Steve, thank you. Alex, we've got about 2 minutes left. Any closing thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things. First, having this kind of discussion is a great thing. And the collaboration with Jamey and his clients and Steve and their collaboration through the NERC process and through this process is really great, as well as a number of other stakeholders, many of whom are represented or giving presentations on this call. And so I think that is a great thing, because I think there are common points that we can agree on. And, you know, Steve made one point about wanting more renewables and how do we get that on the system. You know, the biggest constraint for renewable utility scale is transmission. And developers have to pay for the big upgrades, right? Well, if it's a public policy that renewable energy and clean energy is a good thing for everyone, should that be more socialized? You know, what are the balances there? How do you protect low-income customers? So I think there's real good solutions that are out there and we will disagree on RTOs and things like that, but I think there's a lot of common ground where we can really drive innovation and collaboration to really make the Carolinas and South Carolina a leader, which we already are in solar energy. We're number 2 to California. It's amazing. So I think there's ways to do that. So I'm excited. I'm just too old, right? And it's the Jameys of the world and everybody else who are going to be, you know, leading this revolution.
And Steve or Jamey, any final thoughts?
I would just concur with Alex's sentiments. You know, we fight and skirmish from time to time, but there's a tremendous amount of collaboration, really important collaboration going on among stakeholders around these issues in the Carolinas, and I feel very fortunate to be part of it.
And I think just having lines of communication open, as we often do, is the best thing we can do, and we continue to do that. Alex, your point about transmission is well taken, and certainly that is something that, you know, if the utilities can show that increased build out of transmission will lead to an increase in renewables, then that's where we, you know, my company of the world would say, then that's a prudent return, right? And so I think it's got to be demonstrated that transmission build out or improvements of existing transmission leads to more renewables. And again, you know, you guys have forgotten more of this than I hope to ever learn. I don't know that I'll be leading any revolution. There's only evolution. There is no revolution. But anyways, I appreciate everyone's time and having me a part of this mighty fun panel.
Thank you, guys. That was lucid and wide-ranging and extremely informative, and I'm grateful to all three of you, for Alex and Steve and Jamey, for joining us.